All right, so you know how it is. It's March, and baseball's right around the corner. We're all starting to think about what's going to happen this season, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, opening day is basically here, and everyone's trying to figure out who the contenders are going to be, what the big storylines are.
Exactly. And today we're going to do a deep dive into one division in particular that I think has the potential to be really interesting this year, the NL Central.
Yeah, the Central is always a fun one to watch, and I think it's going to be even more unpredictable than usual this year.
Well, and that's kind of why we picked it for today's deep dive, right? We've got this really cool analysis from David Pinto over at baseballmusings.com. And it's called, Division Preview 2025 NL Central.
Yeah, David, you might know him as like Stats Guru on Twitter. He always does some great work, really data-driven stuff.
Yeah, he does some really fascinating deep dives on individual players and teams. And this division preview is no exception. I mean, he goes really in depth.
Yeah, and what I really like about what he does is like he doesn't just rely on the basic stats or like gut feelings. He actually uses this really interesting methodology.
Yeah, so explain that a little bit, because I think that's one of the things that makes this preview so unique.
So basically he's looking at what he calls, runs created per game or RCG, and he calculates that for like the core of each team. So think your starting lineup, your 5 starting pitchers, and your closer.
Right, so the guys who are going to be playing pretty much every day.
Exactly. Yeah, and then he weights it. So like the starters are more important,
Yeah.
because they're playing more, they're having a bigger impact.
Makes sense.
And then he uses all of that to come up with what he calls like a core winning percentage or CWP.
So it's not like a prediction of their actual record or anything?
No, not exactly. It's more like a way to compare the talent level of each team's their best players.
Right, so like a measure of their course.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a really useful way to look at things because, sometimes a team might have like a couple of superstars, but then the rest of the roster is kind of weak.
Right, or vice versa. They might be really deep, but they don't have that one, game changer.
Yeah, and the CWP kind of helps to account for that.
Okay, cool. So I've got all this data from David, right? The
Mhm.
RCG for the hitters and pitchers, the CWP for each team, and then he also gives us his overall prediction for who he thinks is going to win the division.
Yeah, so we're going to break all of that down for you today and hopefully give you a better idea of what to expect from the NL Central in 2025.
All right, so let's start with the team that David has as the slate favorite, the Milwaukee Brewers.
Yeah, so the Brewers, their CWP is .597, which is, pretty darn good. And their position players, they average 5.18 RCG, which is solid. Not amazing, but definitely respectable.
Yeah, and then their pitching is really where they stand out, right?
Oh, yeah. They're projected to have the best pitching staff in the division by a pretty decent margin. Their RCG is 4.25.
And David really seems to like their starting rotation in particular.
Yeah, he says they might not have like a true ace, like a Cy Young candidate or anything, but they're really deep. They've got 3 guys projected to be right around that 4 RCG mark.
Yeah, Cortez, Peralta, and Myers.
Yeah.
That's a pretty solid top 3. And then he also mentions Woodruff, who's coming back from shoulder surgery.
Yeah, if Woodruff can be healthy and, get back to his old form, that rotation could be scary good.
All right, so the pitching looks like a real strength for the Brewers. What about the hitting?
So David describes their offense as more uneven, which I think is a fair assessment. They've got some guys who can really rake, but then they also have some, question marks.
Yeah, like who are some of the guys that stand out on offense?
Well, Churio Contreras and Yelich are all projected to be above 6 RCG, so that's a good core to build around.
Yeah, Yelich, if he can stay healthy, he's still got that MVP potential.
And Contreras at catcher, that's a huge asset offensively.
Catching is usually a pretty weak spot in the lineup, but not for the Brewers.
Yeah, and they've also got Mitchell in center field, who's projected to be a solid contributor, so their up the middle is pretty strong.
Okay, so the Brewers, they've got a good pitching staff. They've got some pop in the lineup. They're definitely a team to watch in the NL Central.
Yeah, no doubt, and they're the favorites according to David's projections, so we'll see if they can live up to that billing.
All right, let's move on to the Chicago Cubs. Now, they're a team that's been kind of rebuilding for a few years, but it looks like they might be ready to contend.
Yeah, they've got a lot of young talent, and they made some big moves in the offseason, so I think they're definitely a team on the rise.
So David has them projected for the best offense in the division.
Yeah, their position players average 5.26 RCG, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, and they've got a couple of guys who could be real breakout stars.
Yeah, like Matt Shaw, he's a rookie. He's projected to be their starting shortstop, and his minor league numbers were insane, so he could really make a big impact right away.
And then, of course, they added Kyle Tucker in the offseason.
Yeah, Tucker is a stud. He's projected to be the only hitter in the entire division with an RCG over 7.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, he's going to be a big-time difference maker for them. And he's not even their only good hitter. They've got like 4 other guys projected to be above 5 RCG.
So, yeah, their lineup looks pretty stacked.
Yeah.
What about the pitching, though?
So their pitching is good. It's not quite as good as the Brewers. They're projected at 4.37 RCG.
But they still got a really solid 1-2 punch at the top of the rotation with Imanaga and Steele.
Yeah, those two are legit aces, and then after that, it gets a little bit more questionable.
Yeah, the depth isn't quite there compared to the Brewers.
Right, but if Shaw hits like he's capable of, and if Crow Armstrong keeps developing, the Cubs could score enough runs to overcome any pitching deficiencies.
All right, so the Cubs, they're definitely a team with a lot of upside. They could definitely win the division.
Yeah, they're right there with the Brewers in terms of their CWP, so it should be a fun race between those two teams.
All right, let's move on to the St. Louis Cardinals. Now, they're a team that's been consistently good for a long time, but they had a bit of a down year last year.
Yeah, they finished 3rd in the division, which is, not bad, but it's not what Cardinals fans are used to.
So David has them projected for a CWP of .568, which is a little bit lower than the Brewers and the Cubs.
Yeah, and it's interesting because their offense actually looks pretty good. On paper, they average 5.1 RCG.
Yeah, but they don't really have any superstars, right?
Yeah, David says they're more of a team that tries to field like 5 or 6 really good hitters instead of relying on 1 or 2 guys to carry the load.
So like a more balanced approach.
Exactly. Yeah, and they've got 4 guys projected to be in that like high 5 RCG range, but nobody who's really projected to be elite.
So the offense is solid, but not spectacular. What about the pitching?
So the pitching is where things get a little bit dicey for the Cardinals. Their projected RCG is 4.70, which is actually the highest of these top 3 teams.
Yeah, and they don't really have that like dominant ace at the top of the rotation.
No, Sonny Gray is their best starter, and he's projected to be pretty good. But after him, there are a lot of question marks.
Yeah, their rotation could end up being the worst in the division, according to David.
And their closer, Ryan Helsley, he's actually projected to have the lowest RCG of any closer in the division, which is a positive.
Yeah, but that might not matter if the starters are giving up a ton of runs.
Right. So overall, I think the Cardinals are a team that could be competitive, but they're going to need a lot of things to go right.
Yeah, they're going to need some guys to outperform their projections, and they're going to need their pitching staff to be better than expected.
Yeah, if those things happen, they could definitely make a run at the division title, but it's not going to be easy.
All right, let's move on to the Cincinnati Reds. Now, they're a team that's been rebuilding for a while, but they've got some exciting young players.
Yeah, they're definitely a team with a lot of potential, but they're still probably a year or 2 away from being serious contenders.
So David has them projected for 4th in the division with a CWP of .536.
Yeah, their offense is projected to be okay. Their RCG is 4.82, but their pitching is a little bit of a concern at 4.59.
Yeah, they don't really have that, proven ace at the top of the rotation.
No, their best pitcher is Hunter Green, and he's still young. He's got a lot of potential, but he's not quite there yet.
Yeah, he needs to cut down on the walks and the home runs.
Yeah, if he can do that, he could be a really good pitcher, but he's not there yet.
And then offensively, they're really relying on Elly De La Cruz to be a star.
Yeah, De La Cruz is a super exciting player. He's got all the tools, but he needs to improve his on-base percentage.
Yeah, he strikes out a lot, and he doesn't walk enough.
Right. And if he can get on base more, he's going to be a huge problem for opposing pitchers because he's got so much speed and power.
So the Reds, they're a team that could surprise some people, but they're probably not ready to win the division just yet.
Yeah, they're more of a team to watch for the future.
All right, and finally, let's talk about the Pittsburgh Pirates. They're definitely the biggest underdog in the division.
Yeah, they're coming off a 100-loss season, and they haven't made the playoffs in a long time.
But they do have one really bright spot, Paul Skenes.
Yeah, Skenes is the real deal. He's projected to be the best pitcher in the division by a pretty wide margin.
Yeah, he's the only guy in the division who's projected to have an RCG under 4.
Yeah, and he's only 22 years old, so he could get even better.
But the problem for the Pirates is that they don't have much else around them.
Yeah, their offense is projected to be the worst in the division, and their pitching staff outside of Skenes is pretty thin.
So they're basically hoping that Skenes can carry them.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of their only hope right now.
All right, so let's recap David's predictions for the NL Central.
He's got the Brewers at 33% to win the division, the Cubs at 32%, the Cardinals at 22%, the Reds at 10%, and the Pirates at 3%.
So it's basically a 2-team race between the Brewers and the Cubs.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be surprising to see any of those top 3 teams make a run at it.
Yeah, it's going to be a really fun division to watch this year.
Absolutely. And I think one of the big things to watch is going to be the development of those young stars like De La Cruz and Skenes.
Yeah, if those guys can take another step forward, it's going to make the NL Central even more exciting.
All right, well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the 2025 NL Central. The big thanks to David Pinto for the fantastic analysis.
Yeah, definitely check out his work over at baseballmusings.com. He's got some great stuff.
And for all of you listening, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into the world of baseball.
So until then, keep those bats swinging and those gloves oiled.
And as always, keep thinking critically about the game we all love.
Now, for you, the listener, here's something to think about. This division is wide open this year. Any of these teams can make a run at it. So who do you think is going to come out on top?
And what's that one unexpected thing that could happen that completely changes the script? Maybe a breakout season from a young player or a surprise trade.
It's going to be a fun one to watch, so buckle up and get ready for some baseball.
We'll see you next week.